Hello, everybody. I'm Amelia,
Hi. Tom?
and we are in Mark 12. I'm going to tell the story this week because part of it is very dear to my heart. It's a part about the poor widow who gave a very small contribution to the treasury. That's a story I learned in Spanish to teach in Guatemala now, like 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we had an incredible session with a group of widows there. So I asked Tom if I could tell that. Now I had to learn a part that I didn't know. That's right before that. So we'll see how that goes.
Go for it.
All right. Okay. Well, let me just say that last week's story was about this scribe who came to Jesus and asked which is the greatest commandment. And they had a very positive interaction. Then there's a little section that the lectionary leaves out, which is Jesus teaching, responding to some teachings of the scribes. And that ends with the narrator saying that the crowd was delighted at Jesus's teaching. So I thought that was a fun little detail. And then the story for this week begins right after that. So as he was teaching, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and be greeted in the marketplaces with respect and have the best seats in the synagogue and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses. And for the sake of appearances, they pray long prayers. They will have the greater condemnation." And then Jesus sat across from the treasury and watched people putting money into the treasury. And many rich people gave large sums. A poor widow came and she put in just 2 small copper coins, which are worth just a penny. And then Jesus called his disciples to him and he said, "This poor widow has put in more than all the others, for all of them contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, gave everything she had, all that she had to live on." So that's the story for this week.
All right. So, well, did you had learned the previous story. Did you notice anything as you learned this? Anything that jumped out at you in relation to this story?
Well, yes. That part about the scribes, the way it reads in my Bible and the way I made myself a map for learning it, it reads, as Jesus taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes, comma, and then who do all these things." So it makes it sound like all scribes are like that.
Right.
Then I thought, well, that's strange because we just had the story about a scribe that Jesus said, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And so clearly not all scribes like to walk around in long robes and have the best seats in the synagogue and all of that. So I thought, well, it was all because of that comma that makes it appear that the description's about all scribes. And so anyway, I wondered if we read it, that Jesus is just talking about some scribes, those, maybe it's even most scribes, but not all of them. But the ones he's talking about are the scribes who like to walk around in wearing long robes. And, so he's talking about a selection of scribes. Anyway, that was something I noticed right off the bat.
Right.
I wondered what you thought about that.
Well, I think that there are 2 ways grammatically to take this. One is as in a positive, which you've described as the comma, beware of the scribes, comma, that is those who, the other way to take it is as a restrictive modifier. Those scribes, beware of those scribes who like to. And so it doesn't imply then that this is about the scribes. It implies watch out for those who act this way.
Act this way.
Who want this.
Yeah.
Want the honor, so on. And so there is what you're describing is both grammatically possible, and it also reflects, I think, the assumption on the part of the translators that this is anti-scribe polemic,
right,
rather than Jewish sectarian conflict between the scribes, some of the scribes, and the differences that existed within the community of the scribes and Jesus.
Yeah.
So I think you're right on, and I think that's a more accurate translation and interpretation of the story in its original context.
Okay, then I have a question right up at the front about the long robes. What's the deal about liking to walk? What's with long robes? Because when I see pictures, of biblical times of Jesus' disciples, seems like everybody's got long robes on. So it's clear I'm missing something about this, the clothing norms of the day.
Well, these were long flowing robes that were worn by dignitaries, primarily the high priest, the king, and these were robes that were utterly different than the robes that were worn by, lower class people. So these were the robes of the aristocracy,
Okay.
and that in turn called for respect and honor because of how great they looked, and they were beautiful, but were then highly desired by the elites.
Yeah.
So this was a way of wearing a long robe like this was a way of asserting one's superior status.
Right. And so Jesus is saying, watch out for those men because they devour widows' houses, which does sound pretty terrible. That's a really strong word, devour. What would Jesus be referring to there?
The scribes were functionally lawyers, and they would prepare written documents. That's what a scribe did, was manage the documents. And in these cases, there would be contests for a widow whose husband had given her in his will a house, the house that they lived in. And the scribes would, in various ways, eat up the house of the widow. One way was that they would charge exorbitant fees for preparing the documents for a will, and for, so that they functioned as probate lawyers, but they would charge exorbitant fees that would take away a widow's inheritance. Another possibility was that they would seize the property of the widow in order to pay back taxes that were due to the temple. And so if the husband hadn't paid his taxes up to date, then they would come in and take the land and the house in payment of these temple taxes that were quite significant. a significant percentage of what a widow would inherit, and they'd lose their house. So the scribes were rapacious, and the prophets tradition was one of outrage at the way in which the scribes would treat these. I'll read, this is from Joel Marcus' commentary, which is just excellent on this. But I'll just read a piece of this, which is from Isaiah 10, 1-4. And this is how it reads. Ha! Those who write out evil writs and compose iniquitous documents to subvert the cause of the poor, to rob of their rights the needy of my people, that widows may be their spoil and fatherless children their booty. What will you do on the day of punishment when the calamity comes from afar? God's anger has not turned back, and his arm is outstretched still. So the prophets were enraged at this behavior by the rich to take more and to impoverish those who were most dependent, that is, the widows and the orphans. So that's a theme through the prophetic literature and a critique of those who write. This is another important dimension of this. The scribes were the high literates of their society. Not more than 10 to 15% of people could read. And so they were dependent on the scribes for their legal practices, for their legal things. And so scribes would just rip them off. And it was an enormous scandal.
So they had a no mercy policy towards the widows and poor.
Right.
Yeah. It sounds
Whatever
also like
get.
Jesus was in that prophetic tradition. He ends his kind of description of this, at least those scribes who acted this way, is that they would get the greater condemnation.
Right.
Just as it was Isaiah was, that was his prediction or prophecy with regard to what would happen. Yeah. Okay, so then after, the segue has to do with widows. So the next part, Jesus has his teaching, mentions widows, and then moves into a narrative where we can picture him. He sits opposite from the treasury, and he's just sitting there watching people putting money in the treasury, and he sees a widow. He sees the rich people putting in lots of money, and then the poor widow putting in just 2 small copper coins, about a penny. To get that little detail from the narrator. And then he calls his disciples and he says, this poor widow. So how does Jesus know that the woman was a widow? We know he's God, he knows everything, but how does he know?
There is that, that he was clairvoyant, and but also one can see, she would probably have not been dressed in fashionable clothing, so she would look poor. It wasn't hard to distinguish a widow, and he could also, he might have been able to see that she was just putting in 2 little coins that constituted, a penny, which was virtually nothing, but it was everything that she had.
I'm remembering now that when the first time I taught the story in Guatemala was a workshop in the center in Guatemala City in this institution that was largely to support women's rights. It was an education, it was a Presbyterian-based institution, as I recall.
Right.
But there was a young woman there who was, talk about outrage. She was outraged by this story because she felt, and just the part, about the treasury and not the part about the scribes, but she felt like it was, that this lifting up this woman as giving everything she had, was very oppressive of her, very terrible. So I hadn't, thought about the story that way, but she took great umbrage at this story as something that we should expect that widows would get everything they have to the church. Was her understanding. Is that a valid critique of this story? I mean, is this just about how institutions, and you were talking about the scribes, I mean, they were part of the religious institution of Jesus's day. Is this just another case where the religious institution is preying on poor widows? Or are we to understand this meaning of the story as something else other than that?
Well, the story is clearly a celebration of the widow. It is not a critique of the widow for her stupidity in giving this. It is clearly regarded in the story as an act of virtue. And it's also a celebration of the widows over against the scribes. Mm-hmm. So while I think this is a valid critique, it grows out of a later ideology, and I think does not reflect Mark's intention, which is to celebrate the widow, to celebrate the poor, who he steadily lifts up as those who were chosen by God and who would be rewarded in the age to come. So while I think it's a valid critique, Jesus clearly wasn't encouraging that widows would give all their money to the temple, and that this was then what Jesus was doing in this. He wasn't a big fan of the temple establishment and the way in which they ripped off poor people.
Maybe
So,
partly, I mean, part of what his critique of the scribes was that they do all these things to impress everybody. So they say long prayers in order to impress everyone. What's it say? For the sake of appearances, I lost the phrase for the moment. For the sake of appearances, they say long prayers. And so kind of over against that, he's lifting up someone who's very, very humble, as being more spiritually rich than the scribes and the rich people who gave lots of money, because they were just giving out of what they had. It wasn't sacrificial giving on their part, and hers was. Yeah.
My hearing of this is that Jesus was celebrating the lower class, the people, and this what he's describing is the contrast between the upper class, the aristocracy, those who were rich, and those who were poor, mm-hmm. and that he lifted up and celebrated the poor who were blessed by God, and who he supported. So to read this as a story of Jesus being critical of the poor, I think doesn't reflect Mark's context.
Or critical of the institution, or right, yeah. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you everybody for watching. Have a good week. And remember the poor. Right. So, and celebrate, notice and celebrate very humble people who do great things out of their generosity.
Right.
Bye.
God bless.